You to introduce Leon.
All right, cool. Morning. So my name's Leon Wild. I'm head of automotive, and I'm just here to introduce Mark Galloway, who holds a PhD in astrophysics, and he's come here today to talk to us about how not to die in space. As you're probably aware, it's quite dangerous in space, and Mark's going to give us a bit of an overview of what not to do and how to stay alive, and also bust some of those myths that are out there. Over to you, Mark.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to bring my slides up. Hold on. And I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to have a bit of video on this as well. So I'm just going to, I'm running on multiple screens today. So if I turn to one side, that's because I'm just looking at a auxiliary screen here. So let's start my PowerPoint. Now, I do apologise. So when we originally got in contact with me doing a presentation for Fantastic 21, the plan was that we would not be in lockdown and that I'd be able to be in a lab and I'd be able to do lots of groovy stuff with plasma torches and rockets and making things explode. Obviously, I can't do that at the moment. So it will be mostly me talking and showing PowerPoints. There are some videos as well, but I do apologise. It was going to be a lot more exciting. Right, so I need to reshare that. Hold on, so hopefully you can all see that. I may point out I can't see you at all. So.
We can see.
Okay, right. So I'll start off. So as Leon said, I'm Dr. Mark Galloway. I trained as an astrophysicist, but now I do science communication. So basically I talk about science. It turns out I'm much better about talking about science than I am actually doing it. So it's 60 years since humans first went into space. And over 560 people have been to space, and 19 of those people died. And really, this talk sort of dedicated to the 19. And you've obviously seen the movies a lot, particularly science fiction films. They say that space is the deadliest environment you can imagine. And actually, it isn't as deadly as many other environments. We can live in space, we can work in space. It's just that it's a very novel environment. You know, humans have only been into space for about 60 years. We've only been working in space for about 30 years. And even now, there's only not more than 9 people in space at any one time. So it's its novelty and the fact that we've got these new challenges which really makes it dangerous. So let's look about how not to die in space. So we're basically going to talk about 3 different things where space gets really dangerous. So the first one is getting to space. Obviously, you're on top of a really, really big rocket. That's relatively dangerous. We're also going to be talking about living and working in space, which is a relatively new thing. We've only been doing that for about 30 years. And also coming back from space. Okay. And actually, it's only in these 2 situations when most of the people have lost their lives. So this talk does include props and video. It does include some images and subject matter that if you're a bit squeamish, you might find it a bit upsetting, okay? And it includes a failed launch and where people actually did die. So I'm warning you in advance. So let's talk about getting into space. So traditionally, humans got into space by using a massive rocket. And fundamentally, a massive rocket is a very, very large bomb with you sitting on top of it. In fact, if you think about when they do a launch, the people who are controlling the launch are normally sitting 3 or 4 miles away for safety reasons, and you've just got you on top of it. So obviously it's very dangerous. And it was soon realised that if we were going to launch people in space, that they needed to find a way of escaping if anything went wrong. And certainly at the beginning of space exploration, rocket launches did go wrong a lot. And you've probably seen the recent SpaceX spacecraft test they've been doing where it's exploded. In fact, it's exploded 3 times. You obviously wouldn't want to be on there. So but probably the most successful launcher ever is the Soyuz, which is what we have here. This is the Soyuz FG. It's made more manned launches than any other spacecraft. They still use it to go to the International Space Station. In fact, they probably will use it for a very, very long time. It's actually a very old design. This sort of design comes from about the 70s, but it's very, very reliable, which is why they still use it. On top of it, you might notice they've got this little probe here. And that, in fact, is a rocket with 4 little motors. And it's called the LES, which is the Launch Escape System. So if anything goes wrong with the rocket, the computer, or several computers on board the Soyuz, suddenly realise that it's about to explode or something's about to go very, very wrong. And it fires these 4 little rockets and it pulls the spacecraft away. and Chinese, Russian, and American space flight rockets, crewed rockets, they all have this system. And mostly it wasn't ever used until in 2018. And we're going to show you a bit of video. In fact, actually, I've just realised I haven't shared my sound, but I'll leave that. I'll just carry on. So this is the MS-10 launch. It's got 2 astronauts in it, and it takes off absolutely fine. Everything's going really, really well. And then suddenly it gets to the point where its booster rockets, which are attached on the side, have to separate, and that failed. And basically the rocket is now out of control. Now, if their crew had no way of getting out, they would have been lost. We would have lost the crew. A previous incident in 1983, there was a fire at the base of one of the Soyuz rockets, and you might have seen the recent landing of one of the Elon Musk spacecraft where it had a fire on the space pad. Again, the crew got away by using the LES. It fired, it pulled them away 6 seconds before 300 tons of fuel exploded. You'll see in a minute, this will fire, you'll see it go wrong. I'm just going to bring it forward a bit. There you go. And there it's going wrong. They had to self-destruct the actual rocket body, and it's fired, or the crew got down completely safely. So you can see it's really important for having, there we go. There. And it's jettisoned the rocket, and they've managed to escape. So it's really, really important to have an LES. So if we go back to the 1970s, when the Americans were designing the space shuttle, they basically designed the space shuttle so it was so unbelievably safe that they thought it wouldn't need a crew escape vessel. And this is Challenger. So this is something like the 28th launch of the space shuttle. It was in 1986. Some of you have might actually seen this launch. I'm just going to go a little bit further on.
4, 3, 2, 1.
So when the shuttle was originally designed, and when the first shuttle was actually launched, the 2 crew members on board had an ejector seat, but that was removed to save weight because they thought it was so safe they would never need it. And actually, this was a really terrible mistake. To think that going into space is very, very routine. So I don't know how many people have ever seen this. I remember watching this launch on television very, very vividly, and was really, really shocked about what happened. So the space shuttle consists of the orbiter here, 2 solid rocket launchers on either side, and this big thing here is a fuel tank. Okay, and they're all jettisoned, and the only bit that comes back is the shuttle, as you probably know. At this point, what we don't know is one of these solid rocket boosters is going wrong. It's opening up. It's actually rather stupidly, in hindsight, made of segments, and the segments are beginning to separate. And hot fuel is coming out of the side of the rocket. Now, you've got to remember, these crew have no way of getting out of this vessel. The main fuel tank exploded, and actually at this point the crew are still alive with no way of getting out. So now all rockets have an LES. We know from these accidents that you really need a way to escape from the spacecraft. Unfortunately, the shuttle fleet continued to fly until it was decommissioned in 2011 with no escape mechanism. They did have some idea about being able to jump out the side of the space shuttle, open the hatch, but generally speaking, that was only feasible in certain scenarios. So if we look at other systems, so SpaceX has designed an LES for their Dragon capsule. They don't use a rocket on the top that pulls the capsule away. They basically have the entire capsule is self-propelled, and actually that self-propulsion is actually part of its landing system when it comes back on Earth, and you've probably seen them land on Earth. And I'm going to show you how the 10, Dragon capsule launches.
9, 8.
It's quite
7,
spectacular.
6.
So this is just
5,
the capsule.
4.
This is what would
3,
happen if the
2,
rocket, the Falcon
1,
rocket that it's sitting on top, went wrong. So the crew gets pulled away from the exploding spacecraft, or the malfunctioning spacecraft, gets pulled away to safety.
For over 1 kilometer.
So at this point, it's a kilometre away from the explosion. The crew are safe, and they just parachute back to Earth, entirely safe. So you can see them.
10.
So a way of getting around this, of course, is actually not to be in a rocket at all. And we've seen science fiction films, so you might see Star Wars and Star Trek movies and all the other countless movies you see. But these spacecraft that land on Earth or land on different planets, they don't have a different system of landing. They don't have a big rocket taking off. They just take off and land like a plane. That's called single stage to orbit, and we're actually working with that on that at the moment. So Skylon is a single stage to orbit space plane. It's a plane that can fly to space. So no need for dangerous rockets. And Skylon is easily the safest way to get to space. And it's currently being developed in the UK. And the secret to Skylon is its special engines. I see its engines about to fire here. And they're what we call they're an air-breathing rocket. So it acts like a normal rocket in the Earth's atmosphere, like a jet engine. And as it gets so high, there isn't enough oxygen or air, it turns into a normal rocket that we see during launches. This not only saves a lot of weight going into space, it's also incredibly safe compared to normal launches. So hopefully, by the time that you're sort of maybe a bit older and you have the potential to become an astronaut, rather than flying in a rocket like the big Falcon rockets or the SLS system the Americans are developing with NASA at the moment, you might be flying in Skylon, and Skylon's considerably safer. So I'm very keen on sites get Skylon well funded. It has some money from the European Space Agency and the UK government. They're beginning to test the engines now, so it's looking really, really promising. I think Skylon could potentially save a lot of lives going into space. Okay, so now we're going to talk about living in space. So this is my favourite astronaut. This is an Italian astronaut, this Samantha Christopher. At one time, she held the record for the longest time in space for a woman. She's actually about to go to the International Space Station again. In fact, she did the mission immediately before Tim Peake. So living in space has quite a lot of challenges, and actually some of these are we're struggling to overcome. So the first obvious one is being in free fall and space adaptation syndrome. Basically, you want to puke. So I don't know if you're like me, but every time I go in a roller coaster, it makes me really, really dizzy and makes me sick. And this is because a conflict between what your eyes are seeing and what your ears are telling your brain. So in your ears, you have your balance system, and there's a conflict in your brain between your eyes and your balance system, and your brain basically goes, whoa, what's happening to me? And it thinks it's being poisoned, and its natural response to being poisoned is to throw up. Okay, you really don't want to throw up inside your helmet. It does happen, by the way. About 40% of people who go into space get space sickness, but most of them get over it within about 3 days. But there has been a couple of astronauts and cosmonauts who have been so sick that they've never been able to fly again. It's just one of those things where sometimes your body just can't adapt. But and also puking up in space is just really nasty because obviously it just floats around. You know, so you have to get a little vacuum cleaner to get rid of it. Obviously, using the toilet in space in zero G is quite difficult as well. And one of the real big problems is the fact that your bladder basically tells you when you want to have a wee when it's full. But they found out that people in space, they don't feel their bladders getting full. So it's quite easy to actually sort of wee yourself. So they have to remember to go to the toilet. And actually, when they're in their suits, that's fine because most of them wear nappies when they're outside or actually when they're going to or back from the International Space Station. But you probably don't want to be peeing yourself when you're just working. So they have to remember actually go to the toilet. So that's something that's going to be really, really odd if we're ever working in space a long time, is that you've got to remember to go for a wee. Okay, and this is actually a space toilet. They're adapted. So this little nozzle, you can imagine what that's for, and the hole, obviously, you can imagine what that's for too. And basically what it does is it's got a little bit of a sort of vacuum effect, and it basically sucks the wee and the poo out of you. It's not like someone really, really pulling hard. It's just to pull it away from your body. But it is a challenge going to the toilet in space. They do practice on Earth going to the toilet in space, but obviously it's completely different when you do it the first time. Okay, now we're getting to some of the more nasty things. So cosmic ray visual phenomenon. So this was first discovered by the Apollo crews when they went to the moon. And they noticed that when they were trying to go to sleep, that they were seeing flashes of light in their eyes. And for a long time, we didn't really know what this was. In fact, there's still some argument about really what's causing it. But we're fairly sure it's actually radiation. So cosmic rays, particles that have been emitted from black holes and exploding stars, they're going through your eye. And as they're going through your eye, they're exceeding the speed of light in your eye. Okay, so the speed of light changes depending what material it's in, and that's why we get refraction. But as it goes through your eye, the particle, the cosmic ray, is going faster than the speed of light, and in response to that, it has to lose energy. It does that by giving off a photon, a particle of light, and that's why they're seeing these flashes in their eyes. It's cosmic rays going through their eyes. Now, if you take an MRI scan of an astronaut's brain, and they did this with the Apollo astronauts, you'll find that there are little paths of dead brain cells going all the way through their head. And that's where cosmic rays have gone through their brain and damaged their brain. Now, it's a very, very small path, and a single incident probably won't do any damage. And we're going to be talking about radiation in a little while, but it's obviously worrying. And it also apparently is very, very difficult to sleep. It's one of the things that they say it's quite hard to sleep because you see these flashes in your eye. So we're going to talk about some of the more physiological responses you get. So one of the real problems astronauts face in space is the loss of muscle and bone. So within about a week, an astronaut will have lost about 15% of their muscle weight. And that includes not just the muscles you use to lift and walk. It also includes things like skeletal muscle and also things like your heart. They begin to shrink. This is quite worrying. So they have to exercise to stop this. So ISS crew members have to spend 2 hours a day in the gym working out. The other thing that happens is because your bones aren't supporting your body anymore, you get something called osteoporosis. And osteoporosis is something we see in elderly women quite a lot. It can be associated with having children. And basically what happens is the calcium in your body is being leached out. Now, that calcium can end up in your kidneys, and that it can form little stones called kidney stones. Kidney stones hurt a lot. I've had kidney stones. They're incredibly painful. In fact, you literally can't do anything when you get an attack with a kidney stone. It's incredibly debilitating. Okay, so we have this issue that astronauts being in space, they lose fitness, they lose bone mass, and other things happen to them as well. And that sort of at the moment restricts how long they can be in space. So we've had a crew mission of about a year, and we'll talk about why it was that long, but normally crew missions are not longer than 6 months. When they come back, you may have noticed that astronauts struggle to walk a little bit, and that's because they've got muscle loss and bone loss. It does appear to come back. In fact, Samantha Christopher, who's the astronaut I showed you earlier, she actually had problems with her tongue when she came back. She hadn't used her tongue against gravity for such a long time that she actually struggled to talk for months afterwards. So it's quite a challenge coming back when you've had long-term loss. We're not sure what would happen if you had very, very long exposure to space. There might be a situation where you can never return. You can see here the sort of effect that muscle loss you can have on you. So this would be a normal astronaut's leg before they were launched, and this is what it would look like afterwards. So it's pretty severe. It's a really, really big problem. It could effectively kill you in the end. So we really want to do a lot more work on this. Okay, so long gone. So if you go into a shop, particularly a museum, and they're selling astronaut food, that's gone. So nowadays, the crew on the ISS, they tend to eat a pretty normal diet, and it's very similar to the ones that they have in nuclear submarines. So a nuclear submarine will probably stay underwater for about 3 months. ISS crew stay a little bit longer, about 6 months, but they have new supplies. So the ISS gets resupplied every 3 months or so. So they eat the fresh food first. So they get fruit and vegetables. They get lots of bananas. So they're very, very healthy. And then they move on to the dried and the frozen food. But generally speaking, they have a fairly normal diet, pretty similar to us. They actually have an oven now, so they can make pizza. They celebrated the fact that they've got an oven. And they've also got an espresso machine, which, by the way, costs €3 million to build. But one of the big problems in space is that you don't absorb the minerals and nutrients the same as you do on Earth, and that's because your gut is in 0 G, it's in free fall. So each astronaut has a nutritionist that's assigned to him or her, and they keep an eye on what you're eating and how healthy you do. One of the problems is, despite all the exercise they're doing, your appetite is suppressed when you're being in space. So you actually eat less food. So when you're living in space, you have to be very, very, very careful about what you eat. And of course, you want to avoid spicy food because you don't want to get diarrhea or anything like that in space. It would make you unbelievably unpopular with the rest of your crew. It's not like they can open a window. Okay. Early astronauts complained that they'd lost their sense of taste and smell, and they found that food tasted really, really unpleasant. And this turns out this is due to the fluid collecting your face and your nose. So it's a bit like having a really, really bad cold. It goes away after a couple of weeks. So it's just one of those things that seems to go away. And perhaps one of the worst consequences of diet in zero G is you get a lot of flatulence. So you probably know you're a bit flatulent. You fart a bit when you're on a plane. It's a lot worse. And the general view is that when you go to the ISS, it doesn't smell very good the first couple of days you're there because they're farting quite a lot. But some of the downsides of living in space, not fatal, it's not going to kill you, but it makes that life a bit unpleasant. So there was a big program to understand a bit more about what happened in space. And there's a US astronaut, Scott Kelly, who's this guy on my right. And he happens to have a twin. They're identical twins. This is Scott, this is Mark. And they did a year-long mission with Scott, with Mark staying on the Earth. And so they could compare what happened to them over a period of a whole year. And normally we wouldn't let astronauts be in space for a year because of the physiological effects on their bodies. And they found out quite a lot about what goes on in people when they're in space. And some of it's really, really good. And some of it is really, really bad for living in space long term. So one of the most disturbing things was that Scott's telomeres have got shorter. So telomeres, these little things here, these little bright things on these pictures, they live at the end of your chromosomes. So they're a bit like at the end of the shoelace, your shoelace, you have something called an anglet, and this stops your shoelaces fraying. And this is what telomeres do on your DNA, okay? So they're about 300 bases long, they sit at the end of your DNA, and it stops it breaking. So what's the big deal with Scott's telomeres being shortened? Well, telomeres are related to aging, okay? They stop your cells dividing too many times. So as a cell divides their telomeres, the things at the end, they get shorter, and eventually they stop the cell dividing. So short telomeres are a sign of aging, and they're also strongly linked to cancer. So it looks like Scott is genetically aging faster in space than his brother. We don't know why it happened. And it appears that when Scott got back to Earth, his telomeres started to get longer, but we don't actually understand what's going on. But it's incredibly important we understand this for long-term understanding of space travel. It would seem that being in space shortens your life, but we don't actually know yet. Okay. So another thing we found out from this experiment was gene expression. So gene expression is how your DNA gets turned into proteins, and proteins are basically what governs all the biology that's going in your body. Okay, so it's things like controls your heart, brain function, cell growth, reproduction, pretty much everything. And we know that gene expression is changing in low Earth orbit, and that's normal because it's just your body adjusting to a weird environment. It's perfectly fine. And we know that your body normally goes back to the same gene expression as it had before when it comes back to Earth. But it turned out that after a year, that didn't happen to Scott. About 3 or 4% of his gene expression didn't go back to normal. Now, that might be good for long-term space travel because it's suggesting that if you live and work in space all your life, your body will adapt to that environment. It's bad if you're coming back to Earth. So it might look like that astronauts will have lots of long-term problems when they come back. So if we start having lots of people traveling to space and living into space long-term and coming back to Earth, they might have some very bad long-term problems. At the moment, there's no way we can really resolve that, although, well, there's potentially one way because we're not entirely sure why it's happening, but we'll be able to, we'll be talking about that later. So medical emergencies. So there's been a number of experiments undertaken to look at how to perform surgery in low G conditions, such as those found in the ISS. And effectively, any operation that involves opening up an astronaut and sticking your hand in isn't going to work. Your insides tend to float around a lot in 0G. The blood gets in the way. Hence, this experiment where they're trying to do an operation. They're in a plane that's doing a dive, so it feels like free fall, and they're trying to do an operation simulating 0G. Keyhole surgery does seem to work. So if you've got you need an operation, they can do it with keyhole surgery. That seems to be ineffective. The International Space Station does have a comprehensive medical care that includes a defibrillator, oxygen, anaesthetics, ultrasound, and a dentistry kit, because the last thing you want to do is have a really bad tooth in space. But the general rule at the moment is if you're ill, get them stabilised, get them back to Earth. So yeah, don't get sick in space. At the moment, it's really bad. Okay, so we're now going to talk about the things that you probably see in space. So exposure to vacuum. So it's one of the most terrifying things that can happen both inside and outside a spacecraft or a space crew is a sudden loss of pressure. The general thought is for most people, they think that something like this would happen. And this is from the film Total Recall. Someone's been exposed to a vacuum and they've started expanding like a balloon and they're going to pop. So the other thing people think is going to happen, and this is from Infinity Wars, you probably remember this, that you freeze all of a sudden. And actually, both of these things are completely false, and it's just really, really bad science fiction. And it really makes me angry because you don't have to do these things. You're not going to freeze. So why don't humans expand and explode when they get exposed to vacuum? Well, it's because your human skin is actually quite tough, and you can easily take a one atmosphere pressure drop with like expanding like a balloon. You'll swell up a little bit. It'll look like you're not very well. You might get to effectively twice your size, but you're not going to go pop. Your hands and your face are going to get quite puffy. But the real danger that you have if you get exposed to vacuum is something called the bends. It's also called depression syndrome. And this is a condition deep sea divers and miners can suffer from when they come up too quickly. And the pressure drop causes little bubbles of air, normally nitrogen, to form in your blood. This is incredibly painful, but it can also rupture things like blood vessels in your brain and cause an aneurysm and kill you. And people do die of this every year, particularly divers. They come up too quick. So they have to be very, very careful about how they come up. So really, the real problem when you're in space is actually not expanding. It's actually getting the bends, which is something the divers get. So why don't you freeze in space? Well, humans generate about 90 watts of heat, a typical human being, when they're not doing anything. And your heat is lost on Earth in 4 ways. It's lost through evaporation, so sweat coming off you, radiation, okay, so that's giving off infrared light, conduction, so being in contact with a cold surface, and through convection through air. Well, the only thing in space that you can do is radiate. Okay, and actually your body radiates at about 90 watts. So as long as you're staying still, you're going to be just nice and toasty. Everything's fine. If you start moving around in space, you'll actually start overheating. You're not going to freeze, you're going to bake. Okay, so astronauts, they wear special underwear with cooling pipes inside them, and they have backpacks that have a thermal radiator built in. So that basically stops you cooking. So you're not going to freeze, you're not going to explode. In fact, actually, there's a really, really good piece of video from a series I really, really love called The Expanse, where the science fiction is really, really good. And they show someone being exposed to vacuum. I just want to show you this. So this is a really, really good bit of science fiction. It's really, really realistic. So here we've got a guy, he's got a loose wire in his helmet. And this is exactly what you're going to do. Take a deep breath, open your helmet, breathe out very, very slowly. Do what you need to do. Keep on breathing out. Keep on breathing out. Close your helmet. You're fine. Okay. So we think humans can live about 90 seconds with exposure to vacuum. You might be able to last a little bit longer. You might have a bit of problem with your ears, and you might have some problems with your eyes. But generally speaking, what we've just seen, that little bit of video, is quite realistic. Okay. So one of the more horrific things, perhaps more horrific than decompression, is fire. You can't get out. It's producing toxic fumes, heat. It's consuming the air you need to breathe. And modern fire extinguishers basically don't really work very, very well in space. And there's been a couple of really bad incidences of fire on a spacecraft. So probably the most famous one is the Apollo 1 fire. This didn't happen in space. This actually happened during a practice session. So 3 astronauts, Chaffee, White and Grissom, were training in the Apollo 1 capsule while they were doing a pure oxygen test at the same time. And having people in a spacecraft when it's full of pure oxygen, which is incredibly combustible, was a significant error, I would describe it in. Inside the capsule was a significant amount of electrical insulation, which was combustible, and Velcro, which is also very, very flammable. And it was in 100% oxygen atmosphere. And electrical spark started a small fire, which soon became very intense, and it resulted in the death of all 3 astronauts. They couldn't get out. And it led to the completely redesign of the command module for the Apollo. Then in 1997 on Mir, so Mir was the predecessor to the International Space Station, okay, and it used a different air recycling unit to the International Space Station. It used lithium scrubbers. So lithium scrubbers remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere of the space station. Carbon dioxide in any kind of quantity is really poisonous for humans. So one of those lithium scrubbers caught fire, and what greeted the crew was something that looked like a giant Roman candle burning. It was generating toxic smoke as well as removing the oxygen from Mir's atmosphere. And the Russian commander ordered the Soyuz escape capsule, which is here, to be spun up in case they needed to evacuate. And this is the only time that's been done. It took them 90 seconds to put the fire out, although there was an American crew member at the time, and he said it was more like 45 minutes. 14 minutes to put the fire out, not 90 seconds. And they couldn't breathe the air for 45 minutes. The fire was so hot that it partly melted the skin of the Mir space station. Only on the inside, it hadn't breached, thank God. So nowadays, fire safety is completely central to space travel, and nothing flammable, including clothing, is allowed to fly. And if anything that is combustible, for example, they're doing an experiment with a fluid that is combustible, they can only use it under very, very heavily regulated conditions. Fire safety is absolutely paramount in space. There will be another fire, and potentially people could be killed, but fire is really, really bad in space. You don't get a normal flame because there's obviously no gravity. You actually get this expanding ball of plasma. It's really, really bad. It's not a place you want to be. Okay, floating away. So again, science fiction films really like this. Someone floats away. In gravity, you see someone float away. So obviously working outside a spacecraft is incredibly hazardous, and they try to do it as little as possible. And becoming detached is one of the main horrors. So NASA developed the manned maneuvering system, which is this. So it's basically a little one-man spacecraft. It attaches to your spacesuit, your EVA spacesuit. It's not used anymore, but both Russian and American EVA suits, which are these ones, which you guys own, they have small maneuvering systems just in case you get detached. But there is a rule when you work outside of the International Space Station, which is called the 2 points of contact rule. And that basically means you must be attached in 2 positions to the International Space Station before you take the 3rd point of attachment off. So it's a bit like climbing. So if any of you have been to Go Ape, or one of these climbing things where you're up in the trees, they use a very, very similar rule. They use a 2-point attachment where you must always be attached in 2 locations. If you drift off, they have no way of getting you back. They've got a little bit of maneuvering, which just might be able to get you back, but at the moment, there's no way of going back. And a few years ago, one of the astronauts lost a toolkit that they were using outside the International Space Station. They forgot to lash it down. That disappeared in the distance. It was worth several $1 million, by the way, that toolkit. There was no way they could get it back. So it's a real hazard, but we haven't lost anybody that way yet. Okay. Drowning. Now, you might think that drowning in space just isn't a possibility. Well, as it turned out, it is. And in fact, part of the problem was no one thought it could happen. So in 2013, Italian astronaut Luca Palmatonoro, he was working outside the International Space Station when his helmet started to fill out full of water. And he came very, very close to drowning, and the EVA had to be aborted. I mean, literally, he was within minutes of drowning. And it turned out that there was a filter in his cooling system, and it was blocked, and it was stopping his cooling water returning to the cooling system, returning to the radiator. So basically, it was building up in his helmet. It actually got up to his nostrils before they got the helmet off. And this shows you that something very, very minor, like a filter being blocked, can be a really, really big problem in space. So there are no small problems in space. So a lot of the things that you might do normally is like just take your helmet off. He couldn't do that. He had to get out. So yeah, it's little things that people don't think about are probably going to be the things that are going to cause you problems. So now we're going to be talking about working in space. So basically, you should realise that the two big troubles with working in space is the lack of gravity, and which is actually a benefit because we can do things that we can't do on Earth, but also radiation. And we know how to solve the radiation problem. So this is a clip from the film The Martian. We can use a spin habitat. We've never built one before, but we know how to make it. So by spinning parts of the spacecraft, we can create the feeling of gravity. As you can see here, this is the spin habitat on the Hermes. Okay. In this film, the rate of spin would give it 1/4 of a G, so a quarter of the gravity on Earth. We don't know whether that's enough. By the way, that's about the gravity they have on Mars. We don't know whether that's enough or not, but hopefully it should be. Okay, so we are thinking about if you need a long-term mission to Mars, for example, or living in space, that you'd need some kind of spin habitat to get rid of all those problems we see, like muscle wastage, bone mass wastage, some of the things that we see, the genetic differences and the gene expression problems we're having, they might go away if they live and sleep and mostly work in some kind of gravity. Now, one of the other significant problems which we're talking about is radiation. So on Earth, we're surrounded by small levels of radiation all the time. Don't worry about it, it's perfectly normal. And they damage the cells in their bodies, in our bodies, and normally it kills the cell. Okay, that's fine, and your body just deals with it. But sometimes it can damage the DNA and they turn into cancer. So if you've got mole on your skin, that's normally caused by that. So there's loads of ways that you can get cancer, but radiation is just one of them. You can't avoid it, it's just part of your life, it's all surrounding you well. So in space, there's a lot more radiation. So on the Earth, we're protected from the sun and radiation from supernova explosions and jet black holes, jets from black holes. We're protected by the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth's magnetic field. And the ISS is still in the Earth's magnetic field, so they get some protection. But if they were going to Mars, that wouldn't be the case. As we can see here, it's being bathed in radiation and it's damaging their DNA. So at the moment, we have no practical way of protecting astronauts from radiation. The only solution at the moment is for them to have some kind of heavily shielded bunker, which they go to if the radiation level gets too high, or in the case of a solar flare, they get some advance warning from Earth. But it is a real problem. And part of that real problem is the fact that radiation damage builds up through your life. So every time you get radiation damage, it stays with you. It's a bit like some forms of poisoning. So if you get poisoned by metals, for example, like lead or mercury, those build up over time. Your body can't get rid of them. And it's the same with radiation poisoning. So although we've sort of got a solution for working in zero G, we can have a spin habitat. We haven't really got a solution at the moment for what happens with radiation. And it's likely to significantly shorten how long astronauts can stay in space. It's a really, really big challenge. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about coming home. So most people, if you talk to them, say, well, why do spacecraft get really, really hot when they come back? And this is an artist's impression of the space shuttle coming back. And most of you will think it's actually because of friction. And actually, friction is a very, very small part of it. And for those of you who are doing A-level physics, you've probably seen this equation. And this is the combined gas laws. So basically what happens is that most spacecraft are coming in about 27 times the speed of sound. And they're coming in so fast that the air cannot get away and it's compressed. Okay. And as it's compressed, this equation comes in. So basically it says if you take pressure and volume and temperature of a gas and you change one of these, that equation stays the same. Okay. So if you increase the pressure, you've got to increase the temperature in response. Okay. So basically what's happening is the gas is being compressed, the air is being compressed in front of the spacecraft, and it gets really, really hot. In fact, the air in front of an re-entering spacecraft gets up to about 10,000 degrees. And the outside of a spacecraft is typically heated to about 1,500 degrees by re-entry. So that's hot enough to melt a spacecraft. So typically spacecraft are made out of aluminium alloys to basically make them light. It's also hot enough to cook the crew. So how do you stop that happening? So there's a number of methods. So one of the most common ones is an ablative heat shield. Okay, so ablative heat shields, basically little bits of it come off as they re-enter, so it sacrifices itself. So it flakes off and it takes the heat away. And originally, believe it or not, the first ablative shields were actually made of things like cork, and they were made of wood, and they turn out they're really effective. In fact, the Chinese still use a wooden re-entry shield for their spaceships. They're very, very effective. We've now moved on for different materials, ablative materials, but ablative materials are really good. But the problem is you can only use them once. So once the heat shield's gone, that's it. The other method of doing it is to use something that doesn't conduct very well. So that's called a thermal soak. Okay, and this is what was used on the space shuttle, and the space shuttle was covered with lots and lots of ceramic tiles. But also there's a material called aerogel, which we were hoping to show you today. We've got a piece of aerogel and we're going to put a blowtorch on it, and I was going to hold it. And basically it's very good at insulating, so it doesn't let heat transmit through the body to the spacecraft. The other way of doing it is to have some kind of method of taking the heat away, and that is what Skylon is going to be doing. It's going to be doing what's called passive heating, so passive cooling. And effectively what it's going to be doing is it's going to be channeling liquid helium, it's liquid helium, liquid hydrogen fuel through the bottom of the plane to basically keep the outside cool. It's a very efficient way of doing it, but you can't do that on a capsule. It's too costly and it weighs too much. The Space Shuttle Columbia used a combination of thermal tiles and also material that was very, very thermally resistant in the places where it was most heavily heated, and this would be the wings. And if any of you have seen a picture of the Space Shuttle, you notice that the leading edge of the wings are actually black, and that's because that's made of carbon. And this is what failed when we lost the Columbian spacecraft. It basically had a tiny hole in it, got fractured. That basically caused the plasma, the really, really heated hot air, to get through to the wing. It melted the wing spars during re-entry. The wing effectively melted, and the spacecraft lost control, began to tumble and broke up. And again, this is an accident that was completely avoidable. They knew it happened. They should have done something. Again, no way of getting out, no escape system. So always have an escape system for when things go wrong, or at least have a vehicle that's so reliable we won't have to do that. So one of the other problems with re-entry is actually G-forces. So people think that, you see rockets launch and all their faces get distorted, but actually during launch the G-forces aren't that high. It's about 3G. When they're coming back, they're decelerating really, really rapidly, and that's when we see the biggest G-forces. Typically, when you're coming back, you'll feel about 9G. So most people can handle about 5G perfectly normally. At about 6G, your vision will start going blurry. It will get tunneled. Most people black out at getting over 9G. People on roller coasters sometimes black out. There's some roller coasters that can pull 5G, and some people black out at 5G. Fairly rare, most people don't. So on re-entering spacecraft, obviously that kind of force on you, it can really badly damage your body. So on the Soyuz capsules, and actually all of the returning spacecraft, the crew are fitted with a chair that's molded just for their body, and that basically allows it to support you better for when you're re-entering. In fact, there was a problem about 4 years ago where an astronaut, I think he was a Japanese astronaut, he'd grown while he was in 0G, and that's quite normal. You grow a little bit in 0G, but he'd grown so much that he couldn't fit back into his chair. And they spent a lot of time trying to figure out how they were going to get him back, although it turned out they hadn't measured him right, and he was actually a little bit shorter than he claimed he was, and he did actually fit in his chair, but it is a big problem. So talking about hygiene maneuvers, so in 1975, there was a problem with one of the Soyuz rockets during launch. It didn't use its LES because it was quite high when it was launched. The LES, the escape rocket, is ejected, but its second stage went wrong. And for Soyuz, when they're really, really high, when they're up about 80 or 90 kilometers, rather than using the escape rocket, they use the second stage to escape. And that fired, and it was orientating towards the ground when it fired. So the whole rocket had spun round. It realized it was going wrong. It started the escape mechanism, and it basically shot them down. And unfortunately, the crew experienced 21G, and 21G going the wrong way. And one of the astronauts had such bad internal injuries, Vasily Lazarov, he could never actually fly again. So hygiene maneuvers, really, really bad for you. And the only way to really resolve that is slow re-entry. So that's another example of what Skylon does. It comes in very, very slowly. There are other solutions as well, but certainly things like SpaceX, where they're using rockets to slow them down a lot as they re-enter, is another example of how we can avoid really, really nasty crew injuries from coming in too fast. And by the way, the SpaceX version, where they decelerate a lot before they re-enter, that also makes the spacecraft reusable as well. So exposing it to less thermal load, less thermal strain, and less high G means that the spacecraft is more reusable. And you probably know that the space shuttle had lots of problems with its heat shield. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why it was finally decommissioned, because effectively it was costing so much to maintain, because the heat shield, bits of it kept on falling off. So it was supposed to fly every week, and it was like flying twice a year. So it wasn't very efficient. Okay, so I've nearly finished. So it's probably freaked you out saying, whoa, space is really, really dangerous. But we haven't had a crew loss since 2003. So 18 years, we haven't lost anybody in space in 18 years. And most of the people we lost happened in the early years of spaceflight. And I want to show you in respect of aviation. So when aviation first started, and this is a graph of the number of passengers flying against the number of deaths, okay, we can see that flying in planes has become incredibly safe. And the reason why is every time there's an accident, there's an investigation, and we learn from that accident. Okay. And we see the same in car accidents. So when I was a kid in the 70s, loads of people died in car crashes. We didn't have seat belts. You know, you could sit in the back of a boot of a car. I certainly as a child sit in the back. That doesn't happen anymore. Okay, cars are considerably safer. In fact, cars have got a lot bigger. One of the reasons is to have this crash cell to make it safer. And roads in Britain are really, really safe. Planes flying is incredibly safe. It's the safest form of travel, flying. We're seeing the same with space flight. Space flight is becoming much safer. And certainly when you go into space, and I hope all of you will get a chance to go into space, and certainly it's going to be looking like it can become a more commercial venture and you get a chance to go, it's going to be significantly safer than it was in those early days. It's still not without its challenges. There's still loads of ways it can kill you. And then people will die in space, and they'll be killed by silly things we don't think of, okay? And also doing stupid stuff. But generally speaking, it's looking quite promising. Long term, going to places like Mars, they're really, really big challenges. Don't believe what Elon Musk is saying, okay? They're really, really big challenges. A Mars mission is 2 years. 2 years outside the Earth's atmosphere. No one's ever been in space anywhere near that long. And we don't have any idea what the long-term consequences will that will be. Can we mitigate some of them by doing things like a spin habitat? Yes, we can, but we can't mitigate everything, okay? So things like cancer and isolation, they're all going to be problems, okay? So I've finished. I've actually done quite well. I've got about 13 minutes for questions. So I'm sure you've got loads of questions. I can't see any chat or anything at the moment. So let me get rid of my slides. So I presume Leon's going to moderate the questions for me.
Hello, yes.
Oh, you sound like you're in space there, Leon.
Bear with me 1 second.
Yeah, that's feedback. That's welcome to the 70s. So, right. Yes, fire away. Let's have a look at the questions. How can you count in light years? So that's the first one we've got from Nicola. Okay, so actually astronomers don't use light years, believe it or not. So I'm an astrophysicist by training. I do space. I'm a galactic astronomer, so I study things in the Milky Way. I've also done exoplanets. So I've looked at planets outside the solar system, done lots of things. But a light year is about 10 trillion kilometers. Okay, so it's a distance. It's not a period of time. Okay, and actually professionally we don't use that. We use something else called a parsec, which is about 3.4 light years. In The Martian, the character tried to pill himself. Would that work? Yes, that would work. By the way, I do some consultancy for TV shows and stuff like that, and authors. I haven't done any movies, but we do try our best to try to make the science as realistic as possible, and nearly always the screenwriters just ignore us because it won't make an exciting plot. We can't really go, yeah, they're just going to die. There's no way to save them. Okay, so they just break the laws of physics. That would work, but there's absolutely no way he's going to be able to control it, as it was pointed out by his commander. Do different people go into space have different jobs or aims? That's really interesting. That's a really good point. I love that question. Okay, so initially, basically, the people who were going to space were pilots, okay, because they thought pilots would be able to handle it the best, okay. And then when we started to have the space shuttle, when it was taking 7, 8, 9 people into space, they started to have more people who were scientists. And in fact, actually, there's Sally Ryder, who was a school teacher, and she was going to do a lesson for space. Unfortunately, she was on Columbia, which exploded. Sorry, she was on Challenger, not Columbia. But at the moment, because we only have 6 people in space at any one time, they tend to be multitaskers, so they're doing lots of roles. So again, a lot of them tend to be pilots. So Samantha Christopher is an Italian Air Force pilot. Tim Peake's a Army Air Force helicopter pilot, or was a helicopter pilot. So at the moment, they're picking people who are from a very niche group. But that's expanding. So we're going to get our first disabled person to go into space soon. There's a woman who suffered cancer as a child. She lost both her legs. So they're understanding that people from wider groups go into space. ESA at the moment is, ESA, the European Space Agency, is looking for the next generation of astronauts. I'm afraid you guys are all too young, most of you anyway. But certainly your teacher, Leon here, he's about the age group to apply, and they're moving away from having pilot's licenses. So although they ask you to have a pilot medical, they're not looking for pilots. So you don't necessarily need to be an Air Force pilot. As we go do more and more in space, I think people will get more broader skills. And one of the things I'm really, really excited about is asteroid mining. So there are lots of minerals, a lot of metal on Earth called rare earth metals. So if any of you have got a touchscreen phone or an iPad or anything like that, inside each one of those is a tiny pinhead of an element called indium. And indium is what makes them work as a touchscreen. And we're running out of indium. We've only got about 50 years of indium left. It's almost impossible to recycle at the moment. Asteroids are full of indium. They're full of palladium. They're full of platinum. They're full of metals that we really, really need on Earth. And I can see a job in the next 30 or 40 years will be asteroid miner. So one of you might be an asteroid miner, going up, grabbing bits of asteroid, getting the minerals back, getting very, very rich from it. So yeah, I think we'll see lots of different jobs in space. Anything else? It's gone very quiet.
Wow, it's amazing. Just hearing about the dangers that you came up with earlier, but it's been brilliant.
I always think the drowning one's the one you did. And actually, there was an incident about 15 years ago where one of the Soyuz capsules landed in a lake. So because the Soyuz capsules, they land on land, and it landed in a lake, it sank. And although the crew was safe, because obviously the water can't get in because the air can't get out, they would have suffocated eventually. So they had to rescue them from the bottom of the lake. And one of the early American missions, one of the Mercury missions, the space capsule actually sank as well, but the guy got out. But yeah, drowning on Earth is fine, but no one expected that you would drown in space, which was, I think, a bit fun. By the way, they put that spacesuit back in service and it did it again. So they only have a limited number of spacesuits. They don't really make them anymore. So the spacesuits they're wearing are about 20 years old. And all they do is they adapt the hands and the feet, and basically they get pulled up or pulled in. Samantha Christopher has very, very odd shaped hands. She's got very, very long, thin fingers, and they really struggled getting her gloves. They had to make special gloves for her.
I've got a question actually. I knew that Richard Branson was trying to do some space travel. Is that all sort of stopped now? His passenger flights?
No, that's going ahead. Right, so they're not really going into space. Okay, right. So when you see a rocket launch, it goes up, and then when it gets up to about 20 or 30 kilometers, it turns over. Okay, so it's really easy to go straight up and then straight back down again. So space starts 100 kilometers up. That's a formal definition. It's called the Kármán line. If you're above 100 kilometers, you're in space, right? But you're not in orbit. You're not going to stay up there. So you need to be going sideways at about 22,000 kilometers an hour to stay in space. And that's why the rockets pitch over. Once they get high enough, where most of the air's gone. They can pitch over and just accelerate and go into orbit. Branson's Spaceship 1 and Spaceship 2, they basically just make you go high and then bring you back down again. They recently had a fatal accident, actually. So again, they don't have a crew escape system. They do now. So I think one of the problems is that space travel, people have got very blasé about it. And that's certainly what happened with NASA with the space shuttle. They assumed that a space shuttle was as safe as an airliner, and it never was and never could be. There's a very good report done by a really, really famous scientist. When they lost their first space shuttle, they did a big review. And basically, he said that the space shuttle was unbelievably dangerous, and you need to accept it's unbelievably dangerous. And they didn't learn from their lesson, because almost exactly the same thing happened with Columbia. So, yeah, getting to space is really, really dangerous. Living there, there's lots of long-term risks. And most of that comes from the fact that we don't really understand it very well. Yeah, you'll die just as fast in the ocean. If I put you in the Marianas Trench and you went outside, you'd die. Yeah, that's as simple as that, almost instantaneously. Or, you go into a volcano. Okay, there's loads of places on Earth where humans can't live and would not be able to live for, an inch. You just die immediately. So space is no different from that. The only difference is that we've only been going to space for 60 years. But it is awesome. That is the view behind me of outside the International Space Station. I think that's pretty amazing. Yeah. Although not for me, because I'll be puking up all the time. Are all the satellites likely? Right. So you're thinking of that. Okay. So that's a really, really good question. So space junk's a significant problem, but it's not as significant as they suggest in gravity. Okay. It's one of the big things wrong with gravity. So most satellites are going around the same way. So if they collided, which they do, is very, very rare. Well, if they collide, the material is still going the same way. So the impact velocity is fairly low. Okay, so that's not a problem. The Skynet satellite system, the Starlink satellite system. The main problem with that is if you're an astronomer like me, they're an absolute pain in the backside. I use really big telescopes. I used to use really big telescopes. So when I mean big, I mean like building size. Okay, I've used telescopes. Optical telescopes are 8 meters across. Okay, they cost £100,000 a night to run. They're massive. Okay, and I've had images that I've waited 2 years for completely ruined by a satellite going through it, and there's nothing I can do about that. And Starlink's made that worse, so it's a significant problem. However, there is a rule now that all satellites have to have a way of either coming up or going into what we call basically an orbit that's safe. So all the Starlink satellites basically will be deorbited, and also they're quite low as well. So the atmospheric drag will bring them back. They're only going to stay up for about 4 or 5 years each one. I'm super keen on actually Starlink. When I realised that I was going to move to somewhere that has really bad internet connection, I could have a satellite link instead for about the same price I pay for my broadband at the moment. So, yeah. So if you're an astronomer, it's bad. If you're anything else, it's fine.
I don't know if there's any more questions, actually. I think that's all of them.
That's cool. We finished early, which is good for you.
So would you recommend any kind of a telescope or anything if you're someone that wanted to get into astronomy?
Right. I would say that at some point in life, most people think, "Oh, I want to buy a telescope." So there's like a load of stuff. Start cheap, okay? Because most people don't keep it as a hobby. And to be honest, I've got 3 and I hardly ever use them. And it's also being really good at astronomy is very, very expensive a hobby. You can spend tens of thousands easy. Yeah, there are lots of really good telescopes. Talk to your local astronomy club; they'll give you advice. There's a type of telescope called a Dobsonian. They're really cheap. They're really easy. They're really portable. Skywatcher telescopes are really, really good as well. Get one on the second-hand market is what I suggest. You're not going to see these amazing pictures that Hubble sees, okay? Because you're using your eye, and your eye's unbelievably insensitive to light. So for each particle of light that hits your eye, okay, only about 2% of them actually cause a signal in your brain. Okay, for a cat, that's about 10%. So you can imagine what it's like going out at night being a cat. You know, they can see the Milky Way in all its glory. You know, miles better than we can. Modern astronomical imaging telescopes, even amateur ones, the cameras we buy, they're about 95% efficient. So they see much, much deeper than you can with your eye. So generally speaking, pretty much anything you look through with a telescope with your eye, you're not going to see any colour. And there's a few objects where you'll see a little bit of colour, like Mars and Saturn. And by the way, Saturn's brilliant through a telescope. I remember when I was 7, first time I used a telescope seeing Saturn, it was pretty awesome. So, and that's why I'm an astronomer. But yeah, don't be disappointed. The moon's brilliant. The moon's absolutely fantastic through any kind of telescope or a pair of binoculars. It's pretty epic.
Excellent. Yeah, I had I once saw Saturn for a friend's telescope, and that was amazing, just to be able to see the rings and stuff. But yeah, it was all very much a similar color to it's like a flat color, I suppose you'd call it.
Yeah, it's because you may have noticed that if you go out in the night, there's no color. Yeah, and that's because there's 2 parts of your eye. In the light sensors of your eye, you've got your rods, which detect light, and you've got your cones that see color. And the cones are very, very inefficient. They don't work in low light at all. And basically, they give up the ghost when you're working in low light. So you're working just with the cones, just with the rods, and that's why your color vision goes at low light. Yeah, and that effectively, it doesn't matter how. I mean, I've looked through a 0.5 meter, so that's a pretty big telescope with an eyepiece in it. It's about as big as you can get with an eyepiece in it, and you still can't see any color on most things. So, yeah, I think we're all done.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. It was really, really interesting, and my class loved it as well. So they've.
And I would say, if any of you getting going, please, if any of you fancy going to space, work hard. I'm pretty sure someone on this call will be going to space at some time. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. So don't keep your feet on the ground. Be good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.